Most mornings begin so quietly you barely notice them. The faint hum of a refrigerator somewhere inside the house. Sprinklers clicking 2 yards away. A thin layer of pale blue light settling over the rooftops while the neighborhood still feels half asleep. Maybe you step outside with a cup of coffee warming your hands. Maybe you stand there for a second longer than usual, listening to the soft movement of leaves shifting in the cool air. And at first, nothing feels unusual. Just another ordinary morning. But then you notice it. A single black crow perched on the fence behind your house. Completely still. Watching. Not aggressively. Not nervously either. Just aware. Its feathers catch the early sunlight with that strange oil-slick shimmer crows sometimes have, dark blue hiding beneath the black. You take another step onto the patio, expecting it to fly away like wild birds usually do. But it doesn't. It simply tilts its head slightly, as if recognizing you before returning its gaze to the quiet yard around you. And for some reason, that tiny moment stays with you longer than it should. Because most people can feel when an animal is afraid of them. But this felt different. Calm. Familiar almost. The kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of your own breathing. Somewhere farther off, another crow calls from the trees. Then another answers back. Low. Distant. Measured. The sound hangs in the cool morning air longer than expected. If you're new here, take a moment to subscribe before you leave, because the things you're about to notice may quietly change the way you see the birds around your home forever. Especially once you realize how often these moments happen to people who thought they were imagining it. And that's the strange part. Because after that morning, the crow kept returning. Same fence. Same hour. Sometimes before sunrise, when the sky still carried that deep gray color just before dawn. Sometimes in the evening light, standing alone near the edge of the yard while the wind moved softly through the trees. Never close enough to touch, but never truly leaving either. And this is where things slowly began to change. After a while you stop telling yourself it is coincidence. Not because anything dramatic happens, but because the feeling slowly settles into your routine the way evening light settles across a familiar room. The crow is simply there. Some mornings it waits on the same fence post while the grass still glistens with dew. Other times it appears near the mailbox as you leave for work, turning its head slightly as your footsteps crunch across the driveway gravel. And if you have ever experienced something like this before, you already know how strangely personal it can start to feel. Most people never talk about these moments out loud. They brush them aside. They tell themselves they are overthinking. But deep down, many have felt it before. The quiet sense that certain animals are paying closer attention than they should. A bird lingering outside the kitchen window during difficult weeks. A robin appearing every morning after a major life change. A pair of crows circling overhead at the exact same stretch of road every evening on the drive home. Small things. Easy things to dismiss. Yet somehow they stay in your memory longer than bigger events do. Maybe because the feeling itself is difficult to explain. Not fear. Not excitement either. More like recognition. Like being noticed by something wild in a way that feels unexpectedly gentle. And the strange part is how quickly your own habits begin to change too. You start looking for the bird without realizing it. You pause before stepping outside in the morning, already wondering if it will be there again. Sometimes it is. Sometimes it is not. But even on the quiet mornings, your eyes still drift toward the fence automatically. And that is usually the moment people begin to understand that something inside them has already started paying attention. What makes these moments difficult to ignore is not the bird itself. It is the pattern behind it. The small details that slowly begin arranging themselves in ways most people never stop long enough to notice. After several weeks, the crow no longer appeared random. It seemed to understand the rhythm of the house better than expected. On colder mornings, it waited near the back steps, where the sunlight touched first. On rainy afternoons, it perched beneath the maple branches beside the driveway, perfectly still while water dripped from the leaves around it. And somehow, it always seemed to appear a few seconds before the back door opened, as if it already knew the movement was coming. Researchers have quietly observed behaviors like this for years. Crows are able to recognize human faces. They remember routines. They can distinguish between people who feel threatening and people who do not. But standing alone in your yard at 6:30 in the morning, hearing soft wings shift above you in the half-light, those scientific explanations begin to feel strangely incomplete. Because there is another layer most people never talk about. Birds do not survive by ignoring subtle energy around them. Every movement matters to them. Tone of voice, body tension, habit, emotion, safety. They are constantly reading the world in ways humans stopped paying attention to long ago. And maybe that is why certain encounters feel so personal. The crow was never begging for food, never demanding attention. It simply watched, calmly, repeatedly, like it had already decided something about you before you had time to understand it yourself. And this is where the feeling starts becoming harder to dismiss as coincidence alone. One evening, just after sunset, the neighborhood became unusually quiet. The kind of quiet that arrives slowly, when the last lawn mower finally stops somewhere down the block and the air begins cooling against the sidewalks. The porch light cast a soft amber glow across the yard, while long shadows stretched beneath the trees. And there it was again. The crow sat on the same section of fence, feathers slightly lifted in the evening breeze, watching the back door as though it had been waiting. By now, the distance between you had changed. Not physically at first, but emotionally. Wild birds are supposed to remain unpredictable, careful, ready to disappear at the smallest movement. Yet this one had stopped reacting the way most animals do around humans. Researchers studying crow behavior discovered something remarkable years ago. Crows not only recognize individual faces, they remember emotional experiences connected to those faces for long periods of time. Safe people become familiar. Familiar people become part of their mental map of the world. And once a crow decides a place feels secure, it often returns again and again, watching quietly from a distance before moving closer over time. Standing there beneath the dim porch light, hearing leaves rustle softly overhead, it suddenly became easier to understand how these connections begin. Not through dramatic moments, through repetition, presence, tiny observations repeated over weeks and months until trust forms almost invisibly. The crow shifted once along the fence rail, letting out a low clicking sound beneath its breath before settling again. Calm, comfortable, as though your routine had somehow become part of its own. And maybe that is what unsettles people the most. The realization that certain wild creatures may be studying us just as carefully as we study them. By the beginning of the next month, the routine no longer felt accidental. It became woven into the quiet corners of everyday life so naturally that you almost forgot when it started. The crow was there in the mornings while steam curled from the coffee cup between your hands. It waited on the fence while sunlight slowly climbed across the damp grass. Sometimes it landed closer now, only a few yards away near the bird bath, its dark eyes catching brief flashes of silver in the early light. And what changed most was not the bird. It was the feeling inside the house afterward. The mornings felt less empty somehow, softer. Even on difficult days, there was comfort in opening the back door and hearing the faint rustle of wings overhead before seeing anything at all, as though some small living presence had already noticed you were awake. Then other birds began appearing too. A sparrow hopping beneath the porch rail, a blue jay resting briefly on the mailbox before vanishing into the trees, a mourning dove sitting quietly along the telephone wire at dusk while the sky faded pale orange behind the rooftops. Tiny moments, ordinary moments. Yet together they began creating the strange feeling that the yard itself had become more aware, more alive. You started moving slower outside without realizing it, listening longer, watching the branches sway above the fence line while distant bird calls echoed through the neighborhood air. And the unusual part was how calm it all felt. Not dramatic, not supernatural, just deeply familiar in a way that was difficult to explain to anyone else. The crow remained the closest though, always nearby, always watching without fear, like a silent part of your routine that had quietly decided it belonged there long before you understood that you were beginning to feel the same. As summer moved deeper into the neighborhood, the pattern spread beyond the fence line. It was no longer only one crow appearing at familiar hours. Now there were mornings when 3 or 4 birds gathered quietly in the trees behind the yard before sunrise, their silhouettes barely visible against the pale gray sky. They did not make much noise. That was what felt unusual. They simply remained there, shifting softly between branches while the entire street stayed still beneath them. Sometimes you would step outside and immediately feel it before seeing anything at all. That faint awareness that eyes were already on you somewhere above the roofline. A soft flutter of wings. The creak of branches moving overhead. The subtle sensation that the natural world around the house had become more attentive somehow. And once that feeling settles into your awareness, it becomes difficult to return to the way things felt before. Researchers have noticed that many birds communicate information about safe environments socially. One bird trusts a place, and gradually others begin responding to that trust as well. But standing alone in the backyard at dusk, watching dark shapes glide silently across the fading orange sky, the experience feels larger than simple animal behavior. It feels ancient, as though something older than language is quietly unfolding at the edges of ordinary life. Even the air around the house seemed different now, calmer in certain moments, more still. On some evenings the birds arrived just before sunset, lining the fence posts one by one, while warm light spilled across the grass in long golden streaks. And then came the moment that made everything feel impossible to ignore. One morning, before the back door even opened, something was already waiting directly outside. The next morning arrived under a layer of soft fog that blurred the edges of the neighborhood. The trees behind the yard looked almost faded against the pale sky, their branches barely moving in the still air. When the back door opened, the crow was already there. Not on the fence this time. Closer, standing quietly beside the bird bath with droplets of water clinging to its dark feathers. For a moment neither of you moved. The world felt strangely suspended, as though even the distant traffic beyond the neighborhood had faded away. Then the crow gave a single low call and lifted into the air, disappearing beyond the rooftops while the sound lingered softly in the morning silence. And something about that moment felt difficult to ignore. Many people believe animals notice emotional changes long before humans fully understand them themselves. Not in a magical way necessarily, but through patterns too subtle for most people to recognize consciously. Breathing changes, movement changes, energy changes. Birds survive by sensing small shifts in the world around them constantly. Maybe that is why certain encounters begin feeling strangely personal over time. Ancient cultures across different parts of the world often viewed birds as quiet messengers between the visible world and something deeper beneath it. Not because birds were supernatural, but because they moved so freely between places humans could not fully understand. Sky and earth, silence and sound, distance and return. And standing there alone in the cool fog of early morning, it became easier to understand why people carried those beliefs for so long. Because eventually the experience stops feeling like random wildlife behavior. It starts feeling more like recognition. Like the natural world has slowly opened a door you were never supposed to notice. And what happened a few days later made that feeling even harder to explain away. After that morning, nothing dramatic happened. In many ways, that was what made the feeling stay. Life continued normally. Cars passed through the neighborhood every afternoon. Sprinklers turned on at dusk. Mail arrived. The wind moved through the trees exactly the way it always had. And yet something inside the routine had quietly shifted. Some evenings you found yourself sitting outside longer than before, watching the last light fade across the yard while the birds settled into the branches overhead. The crow still appeared almost daily now, though never in a way that demanded attention. Sometimes it stood silently near the fence while shadows stretched across the grass. Other times it crossed the yard in a slow glide before vanishing beyond the rooftops without a sound. And strangely, the absence mattered too. On the rare mornings when no birds appeared at all, the silence felt heavier than expected, as though part of the landscape itself had momentarily disappeared. That realization settled slowly over time. The connection was no longer about curiosity anymore. It had become something quieter, a sense of belonging woven gently into ordinary life. Many people spend years feeling disconnected from the natural world around them without realizing how deeply they miss it. But once you begin noticing these small moments, it becomes difficult to stop seeing them. The pause before wings lift into the air, the soft tapping of claws against wood, the way birds watch the world with complete stillness before deciding whether to trust it. Standing there beneath the fading evening sky, listening to distant calls echo somewhere beyond the trees, it almost felt as though the world had been speaking softly this entire time. And only now were you finally quiet enough to hear it. By autumn, the mornings had grown colder. Thin frost sometimes formed along the edges of the grass before sunrise, turning the backyard silver beneath the early light. The trees behind the neighborhood had begun losing their leaves now, and every breeze carried the soft, dry sound of branches shifting against one another. And still, the birds remained. Not every hour, not every day, but enough that their presence no longer felt separate from the life of the house itself. One evening, just before dark, the crow returned to the old fence post where all of this had first begun months earlier. The sky behind it glowed with that deep blue color that appears only for a few minutes after sunset, when the world feels suspended between day and night. For a long moment it simply stood there, feathers moving gently in the cold wind while the neighborhood slowly quieted around it. No sudden revelation came. No impossible sign. Only the strange realization that something inside you had changed without you noticing when it happened. You had started seeing the world differently, more carefully, more softly. The birds had not transformed into mystical creatures. They were still wild, still distant, still living within instincts humans barely understand. But maybe that was the point. Many people spend their entire lives moving through nature without ever feeling truly noticed by it. And yet sometimes, through repetition and trust and silent observation, a small connection forms anyway. Something subtle, something impossible to measure. Maybe the birds around your home simply learned your routines and stopped fearing your presence. Or maybe certain creatures recognize safety, calm, and emotion in ways modern humans have forgotten how to see in themselves. Whatever the reason, something about it never feels entirely ordinary once it happens. And perhaps that is why people remember these encounters for years afterward. Because deep down, they do not feel like random moments. They feel like recognition. Quiet, ancient recognition. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. If you enjoy quiet mysteries like this, stories hidden inside ordinary moments, take a moment to subscribe before you leave. Because there are still so many things moving silently through the world around us that most people never truly notice. And somewhere tonight, beyond a dark backyard fence or high in the branches above an empty street, something small and feathered may still be watching the lights inside someone's home with that same impossible calm. Maybe it is only instinct. Maybe it is only memory, but it never feels like only that. And ever since those mornings beside the fence, the sound of wings in the distance has never felt quite the same again.